Well, you heard some of Professor Hans Hendrischke's insights into the economic ties between China and Australia. For an in-depth look, he joins us now live from Sydney. Welcome to the show.
Hello. Hello, Rachelle.
Now, Professor, let's have a look at first the scope of the investment. Just how much investment have Chinese companies made in Australia?
Chinese companies have made substantial investment into Australia for the past decade in mining, and since about the last 2 years, they've changed from mining into real estate and some service-related area. China is a major investor, not large in volume, but coming in as a large investor. And Australia is the second largest recipient country of Chinese investors behind the US.
Now, you mentioned mining among some of the sectors that the investment has been focused on. Has that had any change given the commodity slump? Are there any other sectors that they're interested in?
They very clearly so. In the end, with the end of the mining boom, it was the end of a mining investment boom. Mining has basically built up capacity, so there's very little domestic or international investment going into mining for the last 2 or 3 years. Where Chinese investment has moved and has literally replaced the focus on investment is real estate, both commercial and residential real estate, that nearly makes up 50% of total Chinese investment. And then we have some new areas in the services sector. That is, at the moment, the largest of this is healthcare, where Australian companies, or some at least, in fact, cooperate with American companies. Agriculture is the next area of growth, where investment last year was around 3% of the total.
Now, we did see China try and make more inroads, especially when it comes to energy. But with Australia blocking that Chinese bid for the country's biggest energy grid, how closely does this reflect Australia's attitude towards Chinese investment?
Well, that is an interesting story, and it's actually not so much a Chinese story than a domestic Australian story, in the sense that this investment, or this big project investment for an electricity grid, Ausgrid, was put to foreign investors, and then just before final decision was going to be made, the Australian federal government retracted and said, we cannot pass that on to foreign investors. So in the end, it had to go back to the drawing board and has now been taken by domestic investors. That was for general security reasons, but it's not specifically linked to China. We had another big deal just recently where a decision is yet to be made, an agricultural deal that had the largest land holding in Australia being up for an offer, for a bid. And that seems to be going again to domestic bidders. So we have here a competition between domestic bidders and Chinese bidders, and in the end, it's an issue of ourselves sorting out how we want to direct investment.
So you mentioned that it wasn't a case then of China perhaps being singled out, but more so a question of national security. Are there any other factors involved that could perhaps deter foreign investors?
Well, the national security is a twofold issue, because on the one side, there are practical issues of national security where the federal government has to take responsibility and has to make sure that this remains under its control. There's also another issue at stake, and that's our current public debate, which tends to be very skeptical about China, because we have a strong populist movement that is generally against foreign investment. And that has an impact on China. What the government has done in this respect is to increase transparency, to increase public information on the amount of Chinese investment. One of the interesting outcomes of that was actually that Chinese investment in agriculture, which everybody feared would be very large, was very low, was less than 1%, 0.5% of total foreign investment in agriculture. So there's a bit of an imbalance between the public discourse and the business discourse. On the business side, there's strong support for more investment from China, simply because that integrates Australia into new Chinese markets. And as I said, there are beginnings of Australia cooperation with companies from the United States going together in these markets.
All right, well, unfortunately, we'll have to leave it there, but thank you so much for joining us. That was Hans Hendrischke, Professor of Chinese Business and Management at the University of Sydney Business School.